The morning sun rose slowly over the Turner Ranch, spreading its pale gold across the rolling fields. Elias Turner stood on the porch with his hands braced against the railing, shoulders squared against the day as if he could wrestle it into submission. His hat was already tipped low, shielding his eyes from the glare, though the lines of fatigue etched into his face spoke louder than the light ever could. He had the look of a man carved out of stone and dust, weathered by years of wind and labor. Below him, the cattle shifted restlessly, the distant clang of a cowbell breaking the stillness. The ranch was alive, but it carried the weight of silence. For years, there had been laughter here, his wife's laughter, soft and steady, rising like music above the clamor of chores. Now, there was only the cry of birds, the clatter of hooves, and the steady rhythm of a man working himself to the bone because he knew no other way. Inside the small house, Clara's voice carried down the hallway, light and unburdened. "Papa, are we having biscuits this morning?" she called, her tone bright with the curiosity of a child who had not yet learned the heaviness of want. Elias turned from the porch, forcing his expression into something softer before stepping back inside. Clara was perched at the table, her legs swinging, the hem of her dress wrinkled where she had been tugging at it absent-mindedly. Her dark hair, her mother's hair, was a mess of tangles falling into her eyes. "We'll see what we can manage," Elias said, reaching for the flour sack. He kept his voice even, though his stomach clenched at the thought of how light that sack had become. The cattle had not fetched good prices at the last auction, and the money was thinning faster than he liked to admit. Clara tilted her head, watching him with the keen awareness of a child who saw more than she understood. "Mama used to make biscuits better than anyone," she said softly, then lowered her eyes. Elias's hands stilled on the counter. For a moment, he could see her, Sarah, moving about the kitchen with grace, humming to herself as the smell of warm bread filled the air. He swallowed hard and forced himself back into motion. "Well," he said, his voice rough, "I reckon your mama taught me enough to get by." Clara nodded, though the wistful curve of her mouth betrayed her. She accepted the plate he set before her without complaint, though she chewed slowly, as if remembering what used to be. Elias sat across from her, his appetite gone. He watched her instead, the way her small fingers clutched the edge of the plate, the way her eyes wandered toward the window where the horizon stretched out endless and lonely. After breakfast, the chores began. Elias saddled his horse, the leather creaking beneath his weight, and set out with Clara trailing beside him. She carried a small pail of feed, determined to help though her arms trembled under the weight. "Careful now," Elias warned, glancing down at her. "Ain't no shame in letting your papa handle the heavy lifting." Clara straightened her shoulders. "I'm strong," she declared. Elias smiled faintly, pride mingling with sorrow. She was strong, too strong for her age. She had learned resilience because life had demanded it, not because it had been gently taught. The day unfolded in a haze of labor. Fences needed mending, cattle needed driving, and the sun pressed hot against the back of Elias's neck. Clara skipped alongside him, chasing grasshoppers when she thought he wasn't looking, her laughter carrying across the dry field. Every sound of it tugged at his heart, so much like her mother's laughter, yet with a new lightness all its own. By midday, they stopped near the creek. Elias crouched to fill a canteen, his hands rough and scarred. Clara knelt beside him, dipping her fingers into the cool water. "Papa," she said suddenly, "why don't we go to town more?" The other children play together after church. They laugh and chase each other, and their mamas sit on the benches. "Why don't we stay?" Elias's throat tightened. He studied the water swirling in the creek as if it held an answer. "We've got plenty to tend here," he said finally. "The ranch don't take care of itself." "But," Clara's voice faltered, "the girls have braids in their hair. Their mamas fix them so pretty." She lifted a strand of her own tangled hair, her lips trembling as though she wished she hadn't spoken. Elias set the canteen aside and brushed the hair gently from her face. His calloused fingers felt clumsy against her delicate skin. "You're already the prettiest girl out there, braids or no braids," he said firmly. Clara smiled faintly, but the longing didn't leave her eyes. Elias saw it clearly now, the ache for something he could not give her. He was father and mother, protector and provider, but he could not replace what had been lost. And she knew it. even if she did not have the words. When they returned to the ranch, the shadows of evening stretched long across the fields. Elias guided Clara back into the house, where the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and the lingering dust of the day. After supper, he tucked her into bed, smoothing the blanket over her small frame. "Papa?" Clara's voice was drowsy, her eyes half closed. "Yes, little one? Do you think Mama can see us?" Elias swallowed hard, staring at the dim light flickering across her face. "I reckon she can," he said softly. "And I reckon she's proud of you." Clara smiled, her lashes lowering as she drifted to sleep. Elias sat by her side longer than necessary, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest. When he finally rose and stepped back out onto the porch, the night air was cool against his skin. The stars stretched wide above him, endless and indifferent. He leaned against the railing, the weight of silence pressing in. Tomorrow would come, and with it more work, more weariness, more loneliness. But the image of Clara's eyes, filled with longing as she watched the children in town, stayed with him. It gnawed at him, a reminder of all he could not provide. For the first time in a long while, Elias Turner admitted to himself that maybe, just maybe, strength alone was not enough. The town of Willow Creek never forgot a scandal. It was a place where the dust carried whispers as easily as the wind, and once a name was stained, no rain could wash it clean. Margaret Hayes learned that truth the hard way. 2 years had passed since her engagement had shattered like glass against stone. Yet every time she walked down Main Street, she could feel eyes turning toward her, sharp as thorns. The women would glance up from their baskets of produce, their gazes cold, their lips twisting into polite smiles that never reached their eyes. The men, though some tipped their hats, often let their stares linger too long, as though she were both temptation and disgrace wrapped into one. Maggie had grown used to it, or at least, she told herself she had. She walked with her head held high, though her heart trembled each time the church bell rang and families gathered together, their laughter spilling like water she could never drink. She carried herself with quiet dignity, yet inside she carried a loneliness so vast it echoed in her chest. Her days were spent in the cramped room she rented above the dressmaker's shop. It smelled of old fabric and mothballs, and the walls were thin enough that she could hear the arguments of the couple next door. She sewed hems and mended torn sleeves for pennies, her fingers raw from the needle. At night she read by candlelight, her eyes aching, her thoughts wandering to the life she had once imagined. A husband's steady arms, a home filled with warmth, children's laughter ringing in the halls. Instead, she had nothing but silence. That afternoon, the sky had turned gray and heavy. Maggie stood outside the boarding house with her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, her basket tucked under her arm. She had paid her rent faithfully for weeks, though each coin left her purse lighter. The landlady, Mrs. Pratchett, blocked the doorway with arms folded across her chest, her lips pursed as though she had swallowed something sour. "I'm sorry, Miss Hayes," the woman said, though her tone held no trace of apology. "I can't keep you here anymore. Too much talk. My other boarders don't feel comfortable, and I won't risk my reputation for yours." Maggie's breath caught. "But I've paid through the end of the week." Mrs. Pratchett shrugged. "Money's one thing, reputation's another. Best you find someplace else." The door shut firmly, leaving Maggie on the steps as the first drops of rain began to fall. She stood there, frozen, the sting of rejection settling deep into her bones. Slowly, she turned away, clutching her shawl tighter as the street emptied and the storm gathered strength. The rain came hard and fast, soaking through her dress, plastering her hair to her cheeks. She walked without direction, her boots sinking into the mud, the wind tugging at her clothes. Shops closed their shutters, lamps flickered, and soon the town was swallowed in a curtain of gray. She sought shelter under the awning of the mercantile, but the shopkeeper emerged quickly, waving her away as though she were a stray dog. Heart pounding, Maggie hurried through the storm, each step heavier than the last. She thought of the church, but she knew what would happen there. Doors closed, whispers louder than prayers. Finally, shivering and drenched, she stumbled toward the edge of town, where the fields stretched out like an ocean of mud. Beyond the fence stood an old barn, weathered and half-forgotten, its roof sagging but still standing against the rain. She pushed the door open with trembling hands, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air smelled of hay and dust, though the corners were dark and damp. She sank to the floor, her basket forgotten, her body racked with shivers. The storm beat against the roof, but here she was, hidden, unseen. For the first time in weeks, tears came. She pressed her face into her hands, her sobs muffled by the roar of the rain. Alone. Always alone. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time was slippery in the dark. She was drifting in and out of exhausted half-sleep when the sound of boots echoed on the barn floor. Maggie's heart jolted, and she sat upright, her breath caught in her throat. The tall frame of a man filled the doorway, backlit by the gray light of the storm. "Who's there?" His voice was low, roughened by years of command. She scrambled to her feet, wiping at her eyes, ashamed of being caught in such a state. It's only me," she stammered. "Margaret Hayes." The man stepped closer, his features coming into view. Broad shoulders beneath a worn coat, a hat dripping with rain, eyes as sharp as flint, yet softened by something unreadable. She knew him. Everyone did. Elias Turner, the widowed rancher. He glanced around the barn, then back at her, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing here?" Maggie swallowed hard. I had nowhere else to go. The storm. I thought I'd wait it out." Elias studied her, his jaw set. She felt the weight of his gaze, but there was no cruelty in it, only consideration. Finally, he nodded once. "You'll catch your death in this cold. Come on. My place isn't far." Her eyes widened. I don't want to trouble you." "You already are," he said, though his tone lacked harshness. He gestured toward the door. "Come on." For a moment, pride and fear warred within her. She had been turned away so many times, rejected so often that the thought of stepping into another's kindness felt dangerous. But the storm raged outside, and the warmth of his steady voice cut through her hesitation. Slowly, she gathered her basket and followed him into the rain. They walked in silence, the mud sucking at their boots, the wind tearing at their clothes. His stride was steady, sure, while she struggled to keep up. At last, the lights of his ranch house came into view, glowing faintly through the storm. When they entered, warmth enveloped her. The fire crackled in the hearth, the air heavy with the scent of wood smoke and leather. Maggie stood just inside the door, dripping, uncertain, while Elias removed his coat and hung it on a peg. "Clara," he called, his voice carrying down the hallway. "We've got company." A small girl appeared, her dark hair tangled, her eyes bright with curiosity. Maggie's breath caught. She had the look of innocence untouched by cruelty, though her gaze was keen. "This is Miss Hayes," Elias said. "She'll be staying a while." Clara tilted her head, studying Maggie with a seriousness beyond her years. Then, to Maggie's surprise, she smiled. "Would you like some tea? Papa makes it strong, but it warms you up." Something in Maggie's chest broke open at the child's simple kindness. She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "I'd like that very much," she whispered. Elias watched the exchange, his face unreadable. For the first time in a long while, Maggie felt the faint flicker of belonging. She had come seeking shelter from the storm. But perhaps, just perhaps, she had found something more. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the land slick with mud and the air sharp with the scent of rain. Clouds still clung to the horizon, heavy and gray, but a thin beam of sunlight pushed through, spilling across the Turner ranch. Inside, the warmth of the hearth lingered, and for the first time in many weeks, Maggie Hayes woke with the faintest sense of safety. She had slept fitfully on the narrow settee in the front room, wrapped in a quilt that smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. Each time the wind had rattled the shutters, she'd started awake, fearful that she would be told to leave as she had so many times before. But each time she opened her eyes, she saw the steady glow of the fire and heard the soft creak of the house settling, as though it too were reminding her she was not alone. When she finally rose, the house was already alive with sound. Elias's voice carried from the kitchen, low and steady, and Clara's laughter followed, bright as birdsong. Maggie smoothed her wrinkled skirt and gathered her courage before stepping quietly into the doorway. Clara sat at the table, her chin propped in her hands as she watched her father pour batter into a pan. The smell of frying cakes filled the room, mingling with the bitter edge of coffee. Elias glanced up as Maggie entered, his eyes lingering on her for a moment before he turned back to the stove. "Morning," he said simply. "Good morning," Maggie answered, her voice soft. Clara beamed at her. "Papa makes pancakes on Sundays," she explained. "They're not as good as Mama's, but they're still nice." Maggie's chest tightened. She smiled at the girl, though her heart ached with the tenderness of it. "I'm sure they're wonderful." Elias slid a plate onto the table. The cakes were lopsided, a little too dark on the edges, but Clara clapped her hands as though they were a feast. He set another plate in front of Maggie, his expression unreadable. "You'll need strength," he said gruffly. "Storm left the fences in poor shape. I'll be working most of the day." Maggie nodded, her hands folding in her lap. She was not used to being fed so generously, and for a moment she hesitated, uncertain if she should accept. Then Clara pushed the syrup bottle toward her with a bright smile, and the hesitation melted. She picked up her fork and ate slowly, savoring each bite as though it were more than food. It was kindness. The day stretched long. Elias left after breakfast, his stride purposeful as he headed toward the fields. Clara lingered at the table, her eyes following Maggie with curiosity. "Will you stay here now?" she asked suddenly. Maggie's breath caught. "I don't know, dear." "I'd like it if you did," Clara said. "It gets quiet here, and Papa doesn't smile much. But you made him look different at breakfast." "Not so serious." Maggie bent down, brushing a strand of hair from the child's forehead. "You're very sweet. We'll see what happens." The girl nodded as though satisfied and skipped off to fetch her doll. Maggie watched her go, her heart twisting. She wanted to stay. She wanted to belong somewhere, to matter to someone. But she knew the world beyond these walls, and she knew how quickly kindness could turn to coldness. By evening, Elias returned, his shirt damp with sweat, his hands roughened from work. He washed at the basin, then joined them at the table where Maggie had prepared a simple stew from the vegetables she'd found in the cellar. He tasted it, then looked at her across the table. "Not bad," he admitted. Color warmed her cheeks. "I'm glad it's to your liking." Clara chattered through supper, telling stories of the calf that had wandered near the fence and the bird she'd seen perched on the barn. Elias listened, nodding now and then, but his eyes strayed often to Maggie, lingering as though he were measuring something within himself. Later, when Clara had gone to bed, Elias remained by the fire, his hands clasped, his gaze distant. Maggie sat across from him, her sewing in her lap, though her fingers moved slowly, distracted. Finally he spoke. "You need shelter." The words startled her. She looked up, needle paused in midair. "Yes," she admitted softly, "but I don't expect." "And Clara needs a mother," he interrupted. His voice was steady, as though he had thought long and hard before speaking. "She's strong, but she misses things I can't give her. A woman's hand. A woman's care." Maggie's heart pounded. She stared at him, the meaning in his words sinking deep. "Elias," she whispered. "I won't pretend this is about love," he said bluntly, though there was a softness in his eyes that contradicted the harshness of his tone. "It's about necessity. 2 lives, both in need. You need a place. My daughter needs a mother. I need a partner who can help shoulder what this ranch demands. It's simple." Her breath came shallow. The weight of every rejection, every cruel whisper in town, every cold door slammed in her face, pressed against her all at once. Here was a man offering her not pity, but purpose. Not charity, but a chance to belong. Still, fear twisted in her chest. "The town will talk," she murmured. "They already do," Elias said firmly. "But talk. Don't keep a man's cattle fed or his daughter cared for. Let them talk. What matters is what happens under this roof." Maggie's throat burned. She lowered her eyes, her hands trembling in her lap. All her life, she had longed for a place, for family, for something more than silence. And now, against all odds, it was being offered. Slowly she raised her gaze, meeting his steady eyes. If you're certain." "I am," he said. "The question is, are you?" The fire crackled between them, filling the silence that stretched long and heavy. At last, Maggie nodded, tears glistening at the corners of her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "I'll marry you." For the first time in years, Elias Turner allowed a small, genuine smile to curve his lips. The decision had been made. What began as necessity was about to change all of their lives. Maggie Turner. The name sounded strange in her mind at first, almost borrowed, like a garment she had slipped into that did not quite belong. But as the days stretched into weeks after the quiet wedding, she began to hear it spoken aloud with a steadiness that warmed her chest. Elias said it with simple finality, never once wavering, and Clara whispered it proudly to her doll, as if testing out the word mother in secret. The wedding itself had been little more than a formality. They had stood in the parlor of the preacher's modest home. A Bible sat open on the table. Rain pattered softly against the windows, and the preacher's wife hummed to the baby on her hip as the vows were spoken. Elias had held her hand with firm assurance, his voice steady as he promised what duty and honor demanded. Maggie's voice trembled when her turn came, yet when she glanced at Clara's wide, hopeful eyes, her courage held. A ring, plain and unadorned, was slipped onto her finger. No lace, no feast, no gathering of kin. Only necessity. Yet for Maggie, it was more than she had ever dared hope for. A place, a name, a beginning. Now the ranch was hers, as much as it was his. She rose each morning before the sun, the way she had watched Elias do. She tied her hair back with a strip of cloth, rolled her sleeves, and set about the work that needed doing. The first weeks were full of blisters and sore muscles. The washboard rubbed her fingers raw, and the heavy buckets left bruises along her palms. Still, she did not complain. She was determined to prove her worth, not just to Elias, but to herself. Clara shadowed her, eager to help, and together they filled the house with small touches of warmth. Maggie mended the curtains, patched the worn quilt, and baked bread that filled the rooms with the scent of yeast and comfort. She hummed as she worked, sometimes softly, sometimes without realizing it, and more than once she caught Elias pausing in the doorway, his eyes unreadable as he listened. But for all the progress made within the walls of the house, beyond them the world remained unkind. The first Sunday after their marriage, Maggie braced herself as she stepped into town at Elias's side. Clara clutched her hand tightly, her braids neat, her dress freshly laundered. Elias walked tall, his expression carved from stone, daring anyone to speak against them. Still the whispers rose. Women leaned toward one another, their bonnets nearly touching, as Maggie passed. She caught fragments, words like desperate, scandal, poor child, slipping like daggers into her ears. She kept her chin high, her face calm, but inside shame warred with anger. Clara, perceptive as always, glanced up at her with wide eyes. Maggie squeezed her hand gently, forcing a smile. After the service, as families lingered on the church steps, Elias overheard one man mutter too loudly about a rancher marrying scraps. Elias turned sharply, his jaw tight, and the man faltered beneath the weight of his glare. Without a word, Elias guided Maggie and Clara back to the wagon, his hand steady at Maggie's back. At home, he spoke only once of it. Let them talk. Their words don't put bread on the table or mend a fence. You belong here. That's all that matters. The certainty in his voice steadied her. Still, at night, when the house was quiet and Clara lay asleep, Maggie would sit awake by the window, staring out at the moonlit fields, wondering if belonging could truly last. The ranch itself became her teacher. She learned how to churn butter, how to stretch meager supplies into hearty meals, how to soothe a skittish mare. Elias showed her how to mend harnesses, his large hands guiding hers with unexpected gentleness. Their conversations were sparse at first, mostly practical, but slowly something softer began to weave between the words. One evening, as they worked side by side repairing a section of fence, Maggie glanced at him from beneath her hat. The sun was setting, casting his profile in gold, the lines of his face etched deeper by the light. He looked tired, but strong, his presence as steady as the land itself. She felt a stirring in her chest, something she had tried to smother since the day he had spoken his proposal. It was not merely gratitude. It was not simply respect. It was the quiet blooming of affection, fragile yet insistent. Clara, too, blossomed beneath Maggie's care. Her hair was brushed smooth each morning, ribbons tied neatly, her dresses patched and clean. She giggled more, her voice carrying across the yard as she played. At night, she begged Maggie for stories before bed, tales of brave princesses and far-off places. Maggie wove the stories from her own imagination, and Clara listened with wide-eyed wonder, drifting to sleep with a smile on her lips. Elias noticed. One evening, after Clara had gone to bed, he lingered by the doorway of the parlor, watching as Maggie folded laundry by the fire. His voice was quiet when he spoke. "She looks happier these days." Maggie glanced up, her cheeks warming. "She's a wonderful child. She only needed someone to see her." Their eyes met, a silence stretching between them that felt heavier than words. Then Elias nodded, his expression softening. "You've done more than I ever could alone." The admission touched her deeply. She wanted to tell him that he had done more than enough, that he had been both father and mother, anchor and shield. But the words tangled in her throat. Instead, she simply held his gaze. And in that unspoken moment, something shifted. The shift became more evident as weeks passed. Elias began to linger at the table after supper, listening as Maggie and Clara spoke. He brought her small offerings from town, a length of ribbon, a bundle of herbs, a book of poems he claimed had been left over at the mercantile. Maggie treasured each gift, not for what it was, but for what it meant. Still, the world outside their home did not relent. One afternoon, while Maggie walked with Clara through town to fetch flour, a pair of women stopped deliberately in their path. Their smiles were sharp, their words coated with false sweetness. "Well, if it isn't Mrs. Turner," one said, her tone dripping with mockery. "Imagine that. Some folks will marry anything these days." The other tittered, her eyes flicking toward Clara. "Poor child. To think she'll grow up learning from the likes of you." Maggie's heart hammered. She held Clara's hand tightly, forcing her voice to remain calm. "Good day to you both," she said, stepping around them without falter. But when they reached the mercantile, her hands trembled as she counted out the coins. Clara looked up at her, eyes wide with concern. "Don't listen to them," Maggie whispered, kneeling to brush Clara's cheek. "People talk when they don't understand. But we know the truth, don't we?" Clara nodded solemnly, then hugged her tightly. The child's arms around her neck felt like a promise that she was needed, wanted, loved. That night, Elias found her sitting alone by the fire, her shoulders hunched. Without asking, he sat beside her, silent for a long while. Finally, he spoke. "What did they say to you?" Maggie shook her head. "It doesn't matter. It matters if it hurt you." She looked at him, surprised by the fierceness in his tone. "They only said what they've always said. That I don't belong. That Clara deserves better." Elias's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "Clara deserves someone who loves her, someone who shows up every day, who cares for her when she cries and laughs with her when she's happy. You've done that. You belong here more than any of them ever will." Tears pricked her eyes. She tried to look away, but he reached out, his rough hand covering hers. The touch was firm, grounding, and she felt her breath catch. For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. There was only the warmth of the fire, the strength of his hand, and the unspoken truth rising between them. Maggie had entered this marriage with no expectations of love. Yet love, quiet and stubborn, was beginning to grow. The summer that year came harsh and unyielding. By June, the skies over Willow Creek had turned pale and merciless, clouds thinning until only a white-hot sun remained. The grass that had once swayed in soft green waves grew brittle beneath its heat, yellowing until it crunched beneath boot heels. The creek by the Turner Ranch, once quick with spring melt, shrank to a shallow ribbon of water that crawled sluggishly between banks of cracked earth. Elias felt the change first in the cattle. They moved slower in the fields, ribs showing faintly through their hides, tongues lolling as they searched for shade that no longer cooled them. Each evening he rode the fence lines, counting heads, noting which animals weakened and which might not last the season. Each morning he rose earlier, hoping the dawn would give him strength, only to find the same relentless heat waiting. Maggie saw it in him, the way his shoulders hunched heavier each day, the way his voice grew shorter when he spoke of feed or water, the way his jaw worked silently when he thought she wasn't watching. She wanted to ease the burden, to step in where she could, but she also knew how fiercely he carried his pride. Still, she refused to stand idle. One morning, as he came in from the barn with sweat dampening the brim of his hat, he found her already at the stove, sleeves rolled high, hair pinned back tight. The smell of cornbread filled the room, but it was the sight of buckets lined near the door that caught his eye. "What's all this?" he asked, nodding toward them. "Water," Maggie said simply. "I've been carrying from the well since before sunrise. I'll take some out to the troughs after breakfast. The cattle need it as much as we do." His brow furrowed. "That's heavy work. Not fit for—" "For who?" she challenged gently, her eyes meeting his. "Not fit for a woman? Elias, this ranch is mine, as much as it is yours now. I can carry buckets. I can sweat under the sun. You don't have to bear it all alone." For a long moment he only looked at her, his lips pressed tight. Then something in his expression softened, a flicker of gratitude slipping past his pride. He gave a small nod. "All right, but you pace yourself. I won't have you falling sick." She smiled faintly. "I'll be fine." Together they worked that day, shoulder to shoulder beneath the unrelenting heat. Maggie's arms ached from the weight of the buckets, her palms blistered from rope and wood, but she pressed on, refusing to yield. Clara followed them with smaller pails, insisting she could help too. Her determination made Elias shake his head, though his eyes shone with quiet pride. The days blurred into one another. The drought deepened. Each time Elias rode into town, the talk among ranchers grew more dire. Cattle lost, fields failing, some already preparing to sell off what they could before ruin set in. He returned home with dust in his throat and worry etched into his brow. And Maggie met him each time with steady hands and calm words. She cooked meals from scraps, stretched flour and beans into hearty stews, and kept the house filled with a sense of order, even as the world outside crumbled. But the struggle wore at him. One evening, long after Clara had gone to bed, Maggie found him sitting at the table with his ledger open, the numbers scrawled across the page, stark and unforgiving. His head was bowed, his hand pressed against his temple. She set a gentle hand on his shoulder. "How bad?" He lifted his eyes to her, weary and raw. "Bad enough. If the rains don't come soon, I'll have to sell half the herd, maybe more. And once they're gone, well, a ranch without cattle ain't much of a ranch." Her heart ached at the defeat in his voice. She slid into the chair beside him, her hand covering his. "We'll get through it, somehow." He gave a low, humorless laugh. "You sound so sure." "Because I have to be," she said firmly. "For Clara. For you. For us." Their eyes met across the worn wood of the table. And in that moment, Elias saw not just the woman he had married out of necessity, but a partner. Steadfast, unyielding, stronger than he had ever dared hope for. The drought reached its cruelest peak in late July. One afternoon, as the sun blazed overhead, a young heifer collapsed near the trough, too weak to rise. Elias knelt beside it, his hat cast aside, his hands rough against its hide as he tried to coax it up. Sweat ran down his temples, his breath harsh. Maggie hurried to his side with water, pouring it carefully over the animal's muzzle. Together they worked, until at last the heifer staggered to its feet, trembling but alive. When it finally stumbled away, Elias sank back on his heels, his chest heaving. He looked at Maggie then, really looked, his eyes burning with something deeper than gratitude. She was flushed with heat, strands of hair clinging to her damp cheeks, her dress streaked with dust, but to him she had never seemed more beautiful. "You don't give up," he said hoarsely. "Neither do you," she answered softly. The silence that followed was thick, with all the words unspoken between them. And then, slowly, as though drawn by something greater than will, Elias reached for her hand. She let him take it, her fingers trembling against his, and in that simple touch was all the truth they had both been holding back. That night, after Clara had drifted to sleep, they sat together on the porch, the air heavy with the promise of another rainless dawn. The stars glittered above, distant and unyielding. Elias's arm brushed against hers, and he did not move away. "I married you because I thought it was necessary," he said at last, his voice low. "But somewhere along the way, Maggie, it stopped being about need. I look at you and I see the strength I've leaned on. I see the heart that's brought laughter back into this house. I see the woman He broke off, his throat thick. Her breath caught, tears stinging her eyes. "Say it," she whispered. His gaze held hers, steady and unflinching. "I love you, Maggie. I didn't expect it, I didn't plan for it, but I do. I love you." The words struck her like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, warm and blinding. She reached for him then, her hands cupping his face, and he bent to her as though he had been waiting all his life. Their kiss was not desperate, but certain, filled with all the tenderness and strength that had carried them through hardship. When they finally drew apart, she pressed her forehead to his, her voice trembling with joy. "I love you too, Elias. More than I ever thought I could." The drought had not broken. The future was still uncertain. But in that moment, beneath the vast western sky, they knew they would face it together. Not out of duty, not out of necessity, but out of love. Through trials of loss, hardship, and the cruel whispers of a small town, Elias and Maggie discovered that what began as a marriage of necessity had blossomed into a love rooted in resilience and devotion. Their bond proved that even in the harshest droughts, both of the land and of the heart, love can take root and flourish into something unbreakable. If you enjoyed this heartfelt journey, don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles so you won't miss the next tale of passion, sacrifice, and second chances beneath the wide western skies.